She paid for the man's coffee in line, unaware that he was a disguised millionaire testing genuine kindness. The door's bell chimed as Claire entered the cafe, her boots leaving drops of water on the worn floor tiles. The aroma of espresso and fresh pastries wrapped around her like a lullaby, both familiar and comforting, yet just out of reach. Outside, the rain came down in relentless sheets, tapping on the windows like impatient fingers. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself. It was an old coat, 2 sizes too big, with torn sleeves, but it was hers. She stepped to the end of the line, clutching the last $5 she had in the world. It was enough for a small coffee, not enough for rent or the next day, but just enough for now. The cafe was simple, smelling faintly of cinnamon and tiredness. The line moved slowly. Her stomach grumbled. In front of her stood a man who seemed out of place. His gray coat hung limply on his tall frame, completely soaked. His shoes were scuffed, and his posture slouched as though he was carrying more than just the weight of the rain. She noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wallet. The young cashier, chewing gum, remained uninterested. "That'll be $4.65, she said flatly. The man stared at his open wallet. I thought I had more," he fumbled, pulling out some coins. Maybe I dropped a bill. I was sure." There was a pause, uncomfortable and stretching, as if time itself had slowed. A woman behind Claire muttered, "Some people just waste everyone's time." Claire glanced at him. His shoulders slumped in embarrassment. His voice had a rough edge, like someone not used to asking for help. The cashier sighed. "Sir, do you have a card?" "I must have left it at home," he said quietly. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate what the coffee might cost her later. She didn't think about her options. Her voice rose, clear and certain. "It's okay. I'll pay for his coffee." The line stood still. The cashier blinked. "You what?" Claire stepped forward, pulling out her crumpled bill. "I said I'll pay for it. Just the coffee." The man turned slowly to face her. His eyes, dark and weary, met hers with a look she couldn't quite place. Surprise, certainly, but something else, something like wonder. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Claire replied. She handed over the bill. The cashier rang it up. No one clapped. No one thanked her. Someone behind her sighed, annoyed by the delay. The man took the paper cup with a quiet "thank you" to the barista, then looked at Claire once more, this time with more depth. "Thank you," he said again, but more slowly, with intention. "That means more than you think." She gave a small shrug. "It's just coffee." He smiled, but not a casual smile. It was one that carried years. Then he nodded and walked toward the door. The door chimed as he left, disappearing into gray. Claire didn't order anything for herself. She had no money left now, but she didn't feel empty. Somehow, she felt full. She sat at a corner table, warming her hands on her coat sleeve. The rain outside continued to fall, tapping gently against the glass, like a whisper she hadn't yet understood. At home, Claire's apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and damp drywall. It was the scent of a place that had once been warm and cozy, but now had been worn down by time and neglect. The kind of space that creaked underfoot, sighed when you sat down, and held on to smells longer than it held on to hope. It was a tiny room, just above an old laundromat, where the washing machines hummed well into the night. The radiator in the corner rattled as if struggling to stay awake, and the window above the sink never fully closed, letting a cold breeze slip through the cracks in the paint. The wallpaper peeled off, as if it had tried to leave but was convinced to stay. The ceiling bore a stain from a leak no one could remember reporting. But it was home, or at least it had been. The eviction notice still hung crookedly on the doorframe, fluttering with every gust of wind that found its way through the gap. Claire had read it twice, once in disbelief and once more, just to ensure the date hadn't somehow changed. 3 days, maybe 4, if the landlord forgot or had a change of heart. But Claire knew better than to hope for mercy. Life had been tight lately, as if grace was in short supply. She dropped her canvas bag onto the floor, where it sagged like an old friend. Her shoes slipped off with 2 soft thuds, and the cold linoleum floor seeped through her worn socks, making her toes tingle. She hadn't eaten since noon. There wasn't much to eat anyway. A bag of rice, a can of soup she was saving for a colder night. She hadn't bought groceries in a week. Not since the diner let her go. Budget cuts, the manager had said. Low sales. There had been fewer customers since the highway construction started. It's nothing personal, Claire, he'd said. But it always felt personal when your name was the one erased from the schedule, when your apron hung alone, abandoned, left behind as if that part of you no longer belonged. She had applied everywhere. Gas stations, corner stores, a bakery uptown that told her she was too shy for the customer-facing role. She even interviewed at a self-storage facility, where the manager asked, "Can you smile less nervously, as if confidence was something you just dial up?" No one called back. The electricity bill had doubled the previous month because the radiator had broken, and she had run a space heater for a week to keep the cold from creeping into her bones. That morning, the power company had called again. "Ms. Langdon, this is your third and final notice. If the balance isn't paid within 72 hours, we'll proceed with service interruption." "I understand," Claire had replied. She always did. That night, instead of turning on the light, she lit the stub of a candle. Instead of dinner, she boiled water for pasta she didn't have, then turned off the burner and watched the steam rise like a tiny ghost. Then, as she always did when life felt too heavy on her chest, she reached for her journal. It was the only thing she'd kept since childhood. The leather cover was soft and cracked at the edges, the pages warped from too much ink and too many teardrops. Inside were old dreams. Floor plans for a bakery she once sketched in the margins of her textbooks, a list of ingredients she could never afford, names of pastries she swore she'd bake one day. Now it mostly held quiet prayers. Still, Claire opened to a new page and gently wrote the date in cursive, November 3rd. She began her entry. "Today I bought coffee for a stranger. I almost didn't. I don't know why I did. Maybe because I saw something in his eyes that felt like mine. Like the world was too loud and too heavy. He said thank you, like it mattered. I think that was enough. Maybe that will be the only good thing I do this week. Maybe that's okay." She stared at the words. They seemed small, fragile, but they were real. And sometimes, real was all she had. Claire slowly closed the journal and tucked it beneath her pillow, as she had done every night since she was 12. That way, if the night got too heavy, she remembered who she still was beneath all the not enough. She curled up beneath the thin blanket, pulling it to her chin. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper. Inside, by the flickering candlelight, a girl with no job, no heat, and no clear future had still chosen to give. And in a world so hungry for more, maybe, just maybe, that was everything. Claire did not expect to see him again. But there he was. Same coat, though less soaked this time. Same tired eyes, though now they held something sharper, more focused. He stood at the edge of the cafe, watching her not with the unease of a stranger, but with the weight of someone who had remembered something too long to forget. Claire had returned that morning not for coffee. She had no money left, but thought to check the community bulletin board near the restroom. Sometimes there were ads for part-time jobs, dog walking, house cleaning, babysitting, anything. She was scanning the board when she heard a voice behind her. Still looking for something? She turned quickly. It was him, the man whose coffee she had paid for. Dressed a little neater now, though his boots were still scuffed. He smiled almost shyly. "You again," Claire said cautiously, still without a wallet. He laughed, a low, pleasant sound. "No, fully equipped today. Just figured I'd try to return the favor." Claire narrowed her eyes. "I didn't do it for a favor." "I know," he said softly. "That's why it meant something." There was a pause. Claire studied him more closely. He didn't look like someone who belonged to this neighborhood. His speech was too careful, his posture too composed. "Who are you?" she asked. He extended his hand. "Tom," he replied. "I'm a freelance writer. Independent journalist. I guess. I write human stories. Real ones." Claire didn't take his hand. "A writer?" she repeated, skeptical. "I'm looking for a story," he said. "And I think you might have one." Claire crossed her arms. "Why would I be a story?" Because you paid for someone's coffee when you could barely afford your own. Because you didn't expect thanks. Because you didn't know anyone was watching. But I was... She said nothing. Tom James continued. Look, I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I'd like to hear more about you, if you'd be willing. Claire hesitated. Something about him felt off. But there was also something that didn't feel wrong. All right, she said. You can ask. They sat by the window, sunlight slicing through the smudged glass in pale streaks. James pulled out a notebook, not the expensive kind, just a simple one with worn edges. He didn't start asking questions right away. Instead, he asked for her name. She gave it to him. Then he asked about the bakery drawing he had noticed tucked inside her notebook when she had briefly opened it to jot something down. Claire blinked. You saw that? I noticed. Details. Occupational hazard. So, she told him about the bakery, about the almond croissants her grandmother used to make every Saturday, about the dream she had since high school to open a place called Sugar and Light, about saving up every tip she earned, and about watching the money slowly disappear again, because dreams cost more than rent ever did. James didn't interrupt. He just listened. His pen moved occasionally. But mostly he looked at her as if she wasn't just a voice but a person with weight, with worth. When they parted that day, he said, Maybe we'll talk again, if you want to. Claire shrugged. Sure, doesn't cost anything to talk. But as he walked out of the cafe, something fluttered inside her. He had returned, and he looked at her like she mattered. She didn't know yet that his real name was James Rowan, that he had written 7 best-selling novels, that his photo had once appeared on the cover of The New Yorker, that he had disappeared from the public eye 2 years earlier after announcing he'd never write again unless he found a story worth the silence he'd endured. She didn't know she was that story. Not yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire and Tom fell into a quiet, almost accidental rhythm. They never planned their meetings. Some days they crossed paths at a cafe. Other times, it was at the little park down the street where pigeons danced around children's feet and the wind carried the smell of street pretzels and fallen leaves. It was always casual, always easy, but it began to feel like a pattern woven into her days, a presence she didn't realize she had started to look for until it was already there. Claire would talk, and James, still Tom to her, would listen. Not just a polite kind of listening that people do out of manners, but the deep, focused kind that made her feel like her words had weight. He scribbled in a worn-down notebook with a pencil that always seemed nearly out of lead, his head slightly tilted, his brows furrowed in concentration. For maybe the first time in her life, Claire believed her story mattered. She told him things she had never said aloud, about how she used to bake cupcakes with her grandmother every Sunday morning, flour everywhere, her tiny hands barely big enough to hold a whisk, about how she had once truly believed she'd have her own cafe by now. She even admitted how many nights she spent sketching logos, drafting menus, and designing warm spaces full of mismatched chairs and cinnamon-scented windows. But then she told him the other things too, about the slow unraveling of that dream, how it came undone not in a single storm, but in the steady erosion of job rejections, utility bills, and quiet loneliness, each disappointment adding up until all she had left was a journal under her pillow and a heart that still hoped, even when it had no reason to. I don't know why I still believe people are good, she said one day, tracing her finger along the grain of the park bench. He smiled at her then, not with pity, but with reverence. Because you are. Their time together became its own kind of sanctuary. Sometimes they barely spoke. They'd walk together for blocks, letting the silence say what words couldn't. And sometimes she'd bring him muffins, barely held together with borrowed ingredients and hope. He would take a bite, close his eyes, and hum as if he was tasting a memory. It made her laugh every time. She felt real again, like more than a problem to solve, like more than a statistic when overdue notice, like someone whose presence wasn't a burden, but a gift, until the day it all fell apart. It started innocently, like most betrayals do. Claire had wandered into the used bookstore on 9th Avenue, escaping the drizzle and the tightness in her chest. She loved the place, with its crooked aisles and chairs that sank too low, and she wasn't planning to buy anything. She just liked the smell of old paper and the quiet. She was skimming through the new releases shelf, more out of habit than hope, when she saw it. A face. Familiar dark eyes. The same quiet smile. She froze. Her heart raced. Her hands turned icy. On the back of the dust jacket, she read James Rowan, a name she hadn't heard in years, yet one the literary world still held in high regard. Best-selling author, reclusive genius, vanished in the public eye after his 7th novel, famously declaring he had nothing left to say. Until now, Claire stared at the photo. She didn't need to look twice. It was him, not Tom James. She left the bookstore in a daze. Back at her apartment, she sifted through the scribbled notes he had left in their shared coffee shop, napkins, and loose pages. Bits of her life stared back at her in ink. Phrases she thought had passed between them privately, thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone else. And there they were, word for word. The next morning, she found him at their usual bench in the park, a notebook open on his lap. He looked up, expecting a smile. She didn't sit. "Your name's not Tom," she said, each word cold, flat. James blinked. "Claire, James Rowan," she interrupted. "Author, recluse, liar." He stood slowly. "Please." "You've been writing about me," she snapped. "You took my life, my story, and turned it into one of your emotional little parables, didn't you?" "It's not like that," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't mean—" "Are you writing a book?" she demanded. He hesitated, then nodded. "Just once." Her voice cracked. "So I'm just another broken girl in your masterpiece? Another sob story to make readers feel noble for a few pages?" "No," he said, stepping forward. "You're the reason I started writing again. Because you're brave. Because you gave when you had nothing left. You made me believe again." She stepped back, her eyes burning. "I helped a man," she said bitterly. "Not a millionaire, not a famous author. Just a man who looked cold and lost." James swallowed hard. "And I was that man." "No," she whispered. "You were a test. And I didn't even know I was being tested." He reached out. "Claire, I turned it into hope." But she was already walking away. The rain began to fall, slow and steady, soaking through her sleeves. She pulled her coat tighter, trying to hold herself together. The betrayal hurt, not because he was famous. It hurt because he had seen her and then used her. James stood motionless, letting the rain soak through his pages, watching the woman who had saved him walk away from him this time. Because of him. The envelope was plain, with no name on the front, just Claire written in careful, slanted handwriting. It was tucked beneath the welcome mat outside her apartment door, barely visible, as if it didn't want to be found unless she truly meant to look. Claire spotted it on her way in, soaked from the drizzle that had lingered all morning. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. She knew who it was from before she even opened it. She closed the door behind her, sank into the small chair by the window, and unfolded the letter with trembling hands. It read, "Claire, I told you stories were everything to me. That was not true. For a long time, I thought the world didn't need another one. Not after everything I had written. Not after the words began to sound empty to my own ears. But then I met you. I thought I was witnessing a moment of kindness from a stranger. What I didn't realize was that I had stumbled upon the story I never expected to find again, one I didn't have the right to believe. I never intended to make you a character. You were never that. You weren't part of my story. You became it. I wanted to show you. That's why I left the manuscript. No publishing house has seen it. No editor, no press. Only you. If you never want to speak to me again, I will understand. But I needed you to know. You changed me. I only hope somehow I gave something back. James." Claire held the pages in her lap for a long time, her breath caught in her throat. He had included the manuscript. She looked at it with quiet dread and curiosity. The title was handwritten on the first page. The girl with no reason left but still chose to give. She flipped to the first chapter. It began with a cafe, a small act of kindness. A girl who offered her last $5 not because she had any to spare, but because someone else had none at all. Each page was her story Not in facts and bullet points, but in feeling, the way she looked at the world when no one else was watching, the quiet strength she carried like a second skin, her laugh, her tears, her dreams about a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. But it wasn't pitiful. It was full of reverence. James had written about her the way one writes about the moon, not simply because it shines, but because it shines even when no one is watching. Claire turned to a page near the middle, where James described watching her help a child tie their shoes outside the park. She spoke gently, as though the world had hurt her, but she still hoped it could be kind. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw her do that. Something no one would write about. And that's when I knew I wanted to write about her. Claire wiped her face, realizing she had been crying quietly. And yet, it was not the kind of crying she had known in recent months. Not the tears of frustration, loneliness, or hunger. This was different, something lighter. Someone had seen her, not for what she lacked or what she struggled through, but for what she gave freely, with no expectation of anything in return. She closed the manuscript slowly, the edges resting on the coffee table. A knock came at the door. She froze. Then she stood, walked over, and opened it. There was no one there, just a faint scent of rain, and somewhere down the street, the sound of footsteps fading into the quiet. Claire looked at the sky, and for the first time in what felt like years, she smiled. Claire had walked 4 blocks past where she meant to turn twice. Her fingers were curled tightly around a manuscript, now softened at the corners from being read and reread. Rain tapped lightly on the sleeve of her jacket, and the wind carried the early breath of winter. She wasn't sure what made her go. Maybe it was the way he wrote about her. Maybe it was the silence in her apartment, now too loud with the truth of being seen. Or maybe it was just this. She had spent her life giving to people who never remembered her name. James had remembered everything. She reached the address printed faintly on the back of the envelope. It was a quiet townhouse on a narrow, tree-lined street. Ivy curled along the iron gate, and a flicker of warm light glowed behind the windows. She stood there for a moment, unsure, then stepped forward and rang the bell. No answer, but the door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pushed it open. The scent hit her first. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a faint trace of brown sugar melting in butter. She stepped into a modest kitchen lined with shelves of old cookbooks and 2 chipped mugs. On the table by the stove stood James, no longer the mysterious stranger, no longer the author with something to hide, wearing a flour-dusted apron and staring at the oven timer as though it might judge him. He turned, saw her, and smiled just slightly, not with relief or triumph, but something softer, like forgiveness. "You're here," he said. She didn't speak. He gestured to the counter. "I tried your grandmother's pecan bread recipe. You once said she measured love by the pinch, not the cup." Claire raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "And you remembered." "I remembered everything," James said. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 warm slices on mismatched plates. The silence between them was no longer sharp but comfortable, like a quilt stretched across something old and aching. They ate slowly. He looked up. "No more lies," James said. "You taught me enough truth." Claire met his eyes. "I didn't mean to be your story," she said. "You weren't," he replied. "You were the reason I started telling one again." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. After a long pause, she reached into her coat and placed a manuscript on the table. "I want to help finish it." He blinked. "You do?" "But not just about me," she said. "There are so many people like me. Women who give their last $5, men who hold doors open to rain, children who share half their lunch. We write their stories." James leaned back. "Ordinary people with extraordinary hearts," he said. Claire nodded. "We remind the world they exist." And just like that, the girl who once had nothing and the man who once had everything but felt empty decided to build something neither of them could do alone. Not out of guilt, not out of rescue, but out of respect. Out of something dangerously close to love. They clinked mugs that night. Not to endings, not to beginnings, but to the quiet, slow middle where 2 lives begin to weave into one. No more lies, just truth and words together. The book hit the shelves on the first Tuesday of spring. It arrived without much fanfare, no celebrity launch party, no exclusive reviews from the literary elite. Just a quiet arrival at independent bookstores, library shelves, and local cafes where kindness was still served beside a hot drink. Its title was Modest Kindness, Even Broke, and beneath the title, in equally unembellished type, by Claire Langdon and James Rowan. To the world, the names together raised eyebrows. A best-selling author returned from years of silence, and a girl no one had ever heard of before. The curiosity sold copies. But the story inside is what made people stay. The book wasn't just about Claire. It wasn't even just about kindness. It was about choosing to care when the world gave you every excuse not to. The first chapter told of a rainy morning, a $5 bill, and a girl who gave what she could not afford to lose. But as readers turned the pages, they found it wasn't just one act. The book was filled with stories of real people. Claire's neighbors, friends, strangers she had once passed on the street, people who gave when no one was watching. It included James's reflections, too, about watching Claire from across a coffee shop, believing he was studying her, only to discover he was learning from her. He wrote about her generosity with the reverence of a poet and the humility of someone who had almost forgotten what grace looked like. It didn't take long for the book to climb the bestseller list, not because it was flashy or clever, but because it felt like truth. Book clubs passed it around with dog-eared pages. Teachers read excerpts aloud in classrooms. Strangers left notes in copies they donated to libraries. This made me cry in the best way. You reminded me of my grandmother. I paid for someone's coffee today. Because of this. Claire, suddenly seen by millions, was stunned. She had never planned for any of it. Fame made her uneasy. Crowds drained her. But when she spoke at libraries, schools, and shelters, her voice grew steadier each time. I didn't write this book to be known, she said in an early interview. I wrote it because we needed to remember that being kind is never wasted. Even when you're broke, especially then, with her share of the royalties, Claire rented a small corner building with a faded blue awning and peeling paint. She named it Sugar and Light, a name she had scribbled in the margins of her journal years earlier. The space was part bakery, part Bookhaven. The front window steamed up every morning with the scent of fresh bread, cinnamon, and sweet coffee. Inside, children read aloud from dog-eared picture books. Teenagers sat at corner tables with free cookies and paperbacks from the Take One, Keep One shelf. No one was turned away, not for being short on money, not for being short on hope. And in the corner, almost every day, sat James. Not as an author, not as someone owed recognition, just as a man who liked watching stories unfold over warm scones and sugar-sticky hands. He had found a home, not in a mansion, not on a stage, but beside a window near the counter where Claire Whiteflower offered cheek and smiled at everyone who walked in like they were the reason she opened the door that day. To most customers, he was Mr. M.O. James, a quiet older man with a notebook always half-filled, who sipped his coffee slowly and knew the names of every child who read beside him. Occasionally, someone recognized him. "Aren't you James Rowan, the writer?" He would nod, then point to the woman behind the counter. But the story started with her. Claire kept writing, but not from a place of desperation anymore. Now she wrote in the calm between batches of muffins. She wrote about real people, ordinary ones who did beautiful, unseen things. She and James started hosting free storytelling nights every other Friday. People shared tales, some messy, some hilarious, some heartbreaking, all of them real. At one of these evenings, a child stood up and said, "My mom paid for someone's groceries last week. She said it made her heart feel bigger." Claire smiled. That was all she ever hoped for. In a world addicted to spectacle, they had built something quietly beautiful, and in the corner, beneath a sign that read "Free Coffee," and old questions, James would look around at the warm lights, the shelves of stories, and the woman who once gave him $5 and never asked for anything in return, and think, this is the best chapter I've ever written. Because sometimes the greatest story is not the one told to the world. It's the one you live together every day. The winter evenings settled over the city like a hush. Snow fell softly, dusting the sidewalk outside. Sugar and Light inside the bakery glowed with warmth. The low hum of the oven, the smell of cinnamon and butter, and the soft flicker of candles lining the counter. It was after hours. Chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, but Claire moved quietly through the kitchen, placing the final touches on the cake she'd been working on since noon. It was a simple vanilla sponge, light whipped cream, and a swirl of caramel across the top. But it wasn't the cake that mattered. It was who it was for. James arrived right on time, just as she knew he would. He stepped into the back door, brushing snow from his coat, eyebrows lifted in surprise at the dim lights and flickering candles. Claire stood in front of the cake, her apron dusted with flour, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Happy birthday," she said softly. James blinked. "You remembered." "I always remember the people who remember me," she replied. He looked at the cake, then back at her. "That's the first time anyone's baked for me in over 20 years. "Well," she said, "you've earned it." They sat at the small kitchen table, just the two of them. No decorations, no crowd, just a scent of warmth, the sound of quiet breathing, and something between them that had taken root long before either of them admitted it. James set his fork down after the first bite. "All my life," he said, "I've written about love. I've crafted it, shaped it, tried to give it language. But I think I just started to live it." Claire looked at him, eyes shimmering with something gentle and sure. "And all I ever needed," she said, "was someone who saw me as enough. Not an idea, not a cause, just me." James reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. No box, no ribbon. Inside was a ring, thin, worn with a pearl barely clinging to its setting. It was not new, not even shiny. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She told me to keep it until I found someone who was kind when no one was looking, who gave not to be noticed, but because they couldn't help but give." He looked into Claire's eyes, his voice quieter now. She didn't say it had to be someone rich or impressive, just someone true. He held out the ring. "Claire, would you stay? Not just in this place, in this life, with me." Claire stared at him, then smiled. "I've been staying," she whispered. "I just didn't know it had a name." She slid the ring onto her own finger. No theatrics, no grand applause. Just two hands. One truth and a love that had grown slowly, like bread rising in silence. The next morning, the bakery opened as usual, but something was different. Children ran to the front door, giggling. The smell of fresh scones filled the air, and James sat in his usual spot by the window. Claire stood behind the counter, arranging a tray of muffins, when a little girl asked, "Miss Claire, what does that sign mean?" She pointed to the hand-painted wooden board James had hung the night before above the door, where kindness first brewed. Claire looked up at it. Her eyes softened. "It means," she said, "this place was built on something that never runs out." Outside, snowflakes danced in the light. Claire and James stood together on the steps of the bakery, her hand wrapped in his, steam curling out of paper cups in their other hands. No camera crews, no headlines. Just the laughter of children running past the warmth of a home built with stories, sugar, and the quiet miracle of two lives that had found each other not by fortune, but by faith. There were no more tests, no more disguises. Only this, a love not asked for, but freely returned. Because sometimes the richest love comes not from what you have, but from what you choose to give away. Sometimes love doesn't come wrapped in luxury or dressed in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a small kindness, a warm cup of coffee, a ring passed down through generations, and a choice to stay. Claire and James didn't find each other through fate or fairy tales. They found each other through a moment of quiet generosity, a moment that grew into trust, then into home, then into something that didn't need to be proven because it was real. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that the smallest kindness can change everything, then we invite you to stay with us a little longer. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of compassion, redemption, and love. That begins where judgment ends. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that whisper, not shout. See you in the next story.